This is Hannibal from the Hannibal TV.com, back from my midnight run where I saw a very large fox while I was on my run tonight. You never know what you're going to see in the middle of the night when you're out there alone on the streets in the dark. But I am here to discuss one of my favorite movies. I like to hurt people. I still have the video cassette. I actually have 2 copies of the video cassette. Somehow I ended up with it twice. You can see Dusty Rhodes on the cover, who has a part in it. But really, the movie is about WWE Hall of Famer, the original Sheik, who is one of my all-time favorite wrestlers. Definitely top 5. Probably the greatest heel of all time. I can guarantee you, unlike Dominic Mysterio saying he hugged Seth Rollins after his match, I guarantee you the original Sheik was not hugging opponents after matches, and he is the most attacked wrestler by fans of all time. His nephew is Sabu, who the Blood Hunter defeated in PCW Ultra earlier this year in a match that's posted on the Hannibal TV. Andre the Giant is in this movie. Abdullah the Butcher is in this movie. Dorry Funk, Skylo Low, Bulldog, Dick the Bruiser, Heather Feather, so many. Luke Graham. More will come to me as I continue to talk about it. I'll tell you Eric Tupelo, Ox Baker is in it. Yes, Ox Baker is in it. And thank you, Cody, that says wrestling needs Hannibal in the ring wrestling. But I'll tell you guys a story. Some of you might find this boring. By the way, this was put out by New World Pictures in 1985, using New World Video, rather, on VHS. Using footage that was mostly filmed in the 70s, but the movie ran out of money and it was picked up by New World Pictures in 1985. They're the same people that did Grunt, the wrestling movie, who later today, Monday, I'm actually interviewing Mad Dog Joe DiCurso from Grunt, the wrestling movie. They also did Tough Turf, one of my favorite movies and tons of horror movies. This might be boring to some of you, but the very first experience I had with this movie was back around 1989. My parents felt I was too obsessed with wrestling, so they would very rarely let me rent wrestling videos because they thought I already watched too much of it on TV, and I never shut up about it. They didn't think it was healthy. Little did they know I'm now making a good living as a wrestling reporter. And anyways, I was being babysat by my grandmother one weekend, who was a wrestling fan. She's British. She used to go to wrestling when she lived in the UK, where it was very popular. She took me to the video store one day and we rented that video. And at that time, I was mostly a WWE fan. And I remember one of the first scenes in the movie is a movie where Dusty Rhodes is getting stabbed repeatedly by the Sheik. There's blood everywhere. It's very gruesome and gory. And I remember my grandmother took it out of the VCR, brought me back to the video store, said it wasn't appropriate for kids. And the manager said, if it's not appropriate for you, it's not appropriate for anyone. Ripped out like the actual ribbon from the video and threw it in the garbage. So I never actually saw it in 89. It wasn't until about 1996 when I finally saw the full thing. And when I saw it in the video store again, in a different video store, I had to rent it because I wasn't allowed to watch it back in 89 and I wanted to see the rest of it. So it is very bloody. It was my first exposure to the Sheik. It was my first exposure to Abdullah the Butcher. And I was a fan of Abdullah the Butcher from this movie. And it wasn't until he screwed me over, and I'm not going to get into that, where I developed a sour taste in my mouth. But at one point, him and I were actually close. and he actually considered me somewhat of a protege. I remember when I got my WWE contract and when I called him to tell him before I failed the medical, I remember Abdullah actually screamed with joy in the phone. He was so happy that I got my contract because he never was in WWE. So he kind of felt that because I had made it, kind of part of him was making it. But we had our big issues. But that movie was my first exposure to it. Terry Funk is great in it. He fights the Sheik in it, as well as him and Dorry Funk fight the Sheik and Abdullah the Butcher. Abdullah fights Andre the Giant in it. There's another scene of Andre the Giant picking a fan up, sitting him on top of the car. There's a good Dusty Rhodes promo in the movie where he says he's wined and dined with kings and queens, slept in alleys, and ate pork and beans. Things that his kids have never experienced that because they've been spoiled their whole lives because their father was Dusty Rhodes. The second generation stars, other than like The Rock, there's very rare second generation stars will match their fathers, and the Rhodes boys certainly never matched their father or even came close in talent or popularity. There's this intergender match in this, as well as an intergender arm wrestling match. So intergender matches have been going on for a long time. Sorry, Lance Storm, I know you hate them, but they do make money. And the wrestling business is a business. It's about making money. Very kayfabe. There's protesters with the Stop the Sheik movement. They feel he's too violent. They're trying to have the Sheik removed from professional wrestling. Supposedly, those scenes were recorded in the 80s. One day I'll have one of the producers that put this movie out on my show, because a funny story is I was doing a video once back when I did videos. This was actually for another channel. And back when I actually had some of my tape collection on display, the producer of I Like to Hurt People was randomly watching another video of mine and saw that I had it in my wrestling video cassette case and messaged me and said, "Hey, are you a fan of this movie?" And I said, "Yes, huge fan of this movie. I've seen it probably at least 50 times. Captain Ed George in this movie is actually the Sheik's son. A lot of people don't know that. The Sheik's wife also makes an appearance in the movie. One thing that's interesting is they're interviewing some of the fans, and some of the fans in the audience are saying that wrestling, and what part of the appeal of wrestling, which I always thought was true too, was you could let out your inhibitions. You could yell at the wrestlers, scream at them, let out all your inhibitions, and you actually would feel good after a show. And it reminded me of now, you have guys like Sami Zayn kicking fans out of shows for offending him when he's a heel, or Cody Rhodes giving the no, don't offend me fans on Twitter, when wrestling fans should be able to have their inhibitions released. That was part of the fun of wrestling. Wrestling is getting so corporate. All the fun is being taken out of wrestling. It's not like it used to be. It's a shame. It's what it is today is not what it was during the I Like to Hurt People days. Maybe I've watched this so many times that now I actually like to hurt people. But I do like to hurt people. I remember the first time I broke somebody's leg was in an amateur wrestling match outside of Syracuse, New York, when I was in high school, my senior year. And this was my 5th match of the day. My 4th match of the day was the guy that got second place in New York State that year in the state tournament. And it was a very tough match. And I remember I really didn't want to wrestle my 5th match. But I remember right at the start of the match, I went for a single leg, and his leg buckled, and his leg actually broke. And I actually enjoyed the feeling of breaking that guy's leg. I pretended I was sorry. and I won that match by default, and I won. It was called the Mohawk Valley Tournament, wrestling tournament. I did win that tournament that year, and that was my first experience where I actually realized, hey, this is kind of fun. Of course, maybe I have a sadistic side, but yeah, I recommend this movie, but it is a little weird. Like, it jumps all over the place. It goes from the Sheik to midget wrestling, or little people wrestling, as Rick Bassman likes to call it. Or then it goes to the male versus female. And then at the end of the movie, they're talking about the Grand Wizard is there with the Sheik, former manager of Billy Graham, and they're doing a promo in the back of the car with the Grand Wizard smoking in the car with the Sheik. I believe he actually died of lung cancer. But they're talking about a match that's going to happen on top of the Renaissance Hotel in Detroit with Muhammad Ali as a special guest referee. And I remember that was just an unusual way to end the match, because they didn't have, or end the movie, they didn't have opponents or anything. They're just randomly talking about a theoretical match they want to have on top of some hotel. And when I interviewed Sabu, there's a full interview with Sabu on this channel, I asked him, did that match on top of the hotel ever actually happen? And he said no. So strange movie, but weird. The crowds weren't very good. If you actually look, maybe because I'm a promoter, I pay a good attention into the crowds. And other than the first few rows, even on the cards where they had big name wrestlers, I guess the Detroit area, by the time they recorded this, was already in its dying days because the crowds weren't that good. There are a few scenes of fans getting mad and trying to attack the Sheik. The Sheik eventually makes the guy that's trying to stop the Sheik movement disappear in this film. Very good kayfabe in the entire film. I like it. Good violence in the film. Good aggression. Confrontation, aggression, violence. Now wrestling is all about family and tolerance and trying to make the world a better place. So I'll get into some of your questions and comments on this movie. Murd says intergender match as well. Rio says the 80s was the golden era of wrestling. It was very well respected. The 80s was my favorite era of wrestling. Maybe that's because when I discovered wrestling. But when I go back and watch wrestling on YouTube, which I'd rather do now than watch anything of any of the current products, it's 80s wrestling and 80s wrestling promos. They also had great promos. And as I said, there's good promos in this movie. Ares said, speaking of fans shouting out, what's the worst heckle I've ever received? I will be perfectly honest to you. I don't actually listen to the fans. Whenever I wrestle, I used to get into my character so much that I really didn't pay any attention to the fans. I have been attacked a bunch of times by fans, but there's no heckle that ever offended me. And I was actually like happy when I got attacked because it made me remember about like the old days of wrestling, and like you could still piss people off if you really want to. People just don't do it anymore. Guy whose name I'm not going to try and pronounce because it's just a bunch of letters and numbers says George the Animal Steel scared him as a kid and was one of the all-time great heels. Dr. Smith X says it's sad what wrestling has become. It is, and you can read listen to my report on what it's become recently with Dominic Mysterio. Well, his feud with Seth Rollins is still going on, for instance, talking about everyone going back and hugging and how him and Ray and Seth sat together, even though Seth reportedly just took Ray's eye out and they all sat down and put a match together. Just makes me want to vomit. Rio says, big Hannibal as a rugby player would have head stomped his opponents. I was a rugby player. We were city champions my senior year. We didn't have a football team at my school. We had a rugby team. I played all 4 years, and definitely the last year in particular, I was the main enforcer of the team, as well as the year before. But I would score as well. I was number 8. Rio says, great video. Papa Shango scared Mike. Merge says, Dominic is very stupid. Yeah, I don't want to... This video, people are going to look up this video to hear about I like to hurt people. We don't want to get that loser in here. Wrestling, let's hope that it could come back. Let's hope that there's some promotions out there that could bring wrestling back to what it was, and let's hope WWE and AEW just continue to fade, because I think AEW and WWE are kind of equal as far as political correctness. Each one is worse on some topics than the others, but it's just sad. Like Stephanie McMahon's comment earlier this week that there should be more female writers because the number of women writers to men is unequal. Why do we need so many writers? We don't have writers in Great North Wrestling. They don't have writers in PCW Ultra. Back in the days when wrestling was great, they didn't have writers. Why can't you just go back to making it wrestling instead of storytelling performances? I don't know. The Sheik would be rolling over in his grave. The original Sheik, Ed Farhat, who, by the way, if you ever want to hear the Sheik out of character, there is a video on YouTube where they're doing a news story on the Sheik, and they just say it's like promoter Ed Farhat talking, and it's actually the Sheik describing himself as a promoter to the people watching the newscast. I've watched that like 30 times because I'm so obsessed with the original Sheik. It's really sad that there's no more heels like that. You need good heels, scary heels, believable heels back in wrestling. So I would recommend this movie, maybe not to the fans of today's storytelling, but the fans of the Dusty Rhodes, because there's good Dusty Rhodes promos. Terry Funk. I like when Terry Funk has a line in here that if you can guarantee somebody's going to get gored to death, you're going to have a sellout, because people like violence. It's true. People love violence, as do I, both watching and dishing it out.